It is my pleasure to welcome David Slavin as our keynote speaker today to the greater Washington area and to introduce him to you. David Slavin is a scholar and a historian at Emory University. He'll be speaking today on inequality, white privilege, and social control in the United States, a historical perspective. In 2001, Johns Hopkins University Press published his book entitled Colonial Cinema and Imperial France, 1919 to 1939, White Blind Spots, Male Fantasies, and Settler Myths. David has taught or lectured at a number of colleges and universities. And I think one of the things that we can lift out of his resume that will help to connect his background to our work here in the Joseph Priestley District is to give you a sense of some of the classes that he's taught. Islam and the West, which he taught at Emory at Candler's School of Theology. Race and Religion, 20th Century Fundamentalism. Comparative Settler States, Inventing the White Race. France and North Africa. Europe, 1789 to 1871, Opium and Empire. Africa and Islam since 1500. Europe, 1914 to 1945. Congo, Maghreb, Mongolia, 20th century global interactions. The Western Mediterranean since 1830. Europe in an era of total war, 1914 to 1945. Film in historical context, race and immigration. Film in historical context, European colonialism. So imagine teaching all of these courses. What kind of preparation and analysis David has developed over the years. He's also done a number of fellowships, and I want to point that out because when he was here in the Washington area doing a fellowship with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, he attended the Unitarian Universalist Church in Arlington, Virginia, and that's where we first made contact with David.
Is that I'm presenting to you a hypothesis which is also a paradigm shift. And the hypothesis runs like this, that race is central to American history. It's not on the side, it's not peripheral, but particularly racial inequality is central to both the history and the contemporary affairs. That even if you think that it doesn't touch you, it actually does. So that's the first thing. Secondly, that privilege is not a benefit. Privilege is not a benefit. That in fact, it is rather the central feature or the keystone in the arch of social control structures and the social control system in the US. It is, in other words, how the ruling elites in this country over the course of its history, right down to the present, maintain their dominance, impose their will, and ensure the smooth functioning of a system of exploitation of labor. Privilege is not a benefit. It actually equals powerlessness to the people on whom the privileges are conferred, foisted, imposed. It translates into powerlessness. For all whites and anyone else who is in a privileged category within the working class broadly defined. So males heterosexuals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all right? And the way to understand race in this country, racial inequality, is to not look only or exclusively at the oppressed strata, but also at the privileged group and the dynamics of the privileged group, all right? Now, the four topics that I'm going to talk about are, first of all, what's euphemistically referred to as climate crisis, and the crisis of the environment, but which is actually planetary destabilization. And secondly, why it's been so hard to implement such a patently no-brainer policy change as health reform. Thirdly, sundown towns as a much wider phenomenon than simply what James Lowen wrote about in a masterful book about people, non-whites, black people being told to get out of town by sundown, in various thousands of towns across this country, but rather that it is a product of white privilege in mobility, a basic human right to go where you want, when you want, and that this freedom of movement, which is constricted and constrained among non-whites, particularly African Americans historically, also includes the fact that there are not just sundown towns in this country, but also whole regions, including Appalachia, right down the road from here, 410 counties that make up the Appalachian Regional Planning District, and also sundown colleges, sundown workplaces, as well as towns and neighborhoods, and how sundown impacted the 08 election race and the 08 race. So that's a third category. And finally, interracial solidarity as a day-to-day spiritual practice for UUs. So those are the four topics, all right? I don't know if we're going to get to all of this, but obviously a lot. So I'll start now with the ecological catastrophe and pose to you the question that frequently is a statistic that's frequently introduced, but rarely around the environment, around the environmental crisis, but rarely is really investigated, and that is the statistic that the United States consumes per capita 2.5 times the produces 2.5 times the greenhouse gas emissions of other industrialized countries, right? Now, we've heard that. Most of you know that statistic. But deconstructed, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Why does the United States produce 2.5 times the greenhouse gases? And I have some answers, and I think they have to do with racial inequality in the United States as a central feature. So, for example, the dependency upon the internal combustion engine as a means of transportation in this country. The lemming-like movements from suburbs to cities and back to get from job to home, right? Including the use of vehicles that use 100 times the amount of energy they waste. I mean, automobiles, you have a 4,000-pound vehicle moving a single 175, 200-pound individual, and the internal combustion engine is inefficient to begin with. So what's up with that? And then all the resources that are used and the inefficiencies of the resources that are used to heat, cool, and stock with appliances, all of those private homes that are all a part of the general pattern of suburbanization. Now, if you talk about suburbanization, what is the fundamental basis of suburbanization, the driving force of it, is white flight. So the relationship between this extraordinary expenditure of consumption of production of greenhouse gases, and the suburbanization and the white flight to the suburbs historically, starting particularly in the mass movement after World War II, is part of of understanding how the race plays such a central role in this disproportionate production of greenhouse gases. Not only that, but those suburbs consumed farmland. So the whole consequence of this high-tech factory farm monoculture kind of agriculture that has come into being